Shalom. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in the annual meeting of the Cattle Sciences in Israel. It was my opportunity to work with Israeli scientists in the mid-90s, and I enjoyed my trips to Israel working with the dairy industry. That's depicted on the left side of the screen, number one. Number two illustrates some of the types of farms that I have worked with over the years and around the world. As we go through these slides, we'll be using numbers to follow the important points that I want to make. The first point is, why is it important to have dairy? And if we look at the number on the left, that shows the carrying capacity or the food producing capacity of cropland that's shown on the bottom. And in this study that was done by scientists a couple of years ago, they did not look at calories. They looked at the entire diet, the essential nutrients that one must consume. And number two shows the kinds of diets that were available. They had 5 versions of an omnivore diet, which is a traditional meat-heavy, protein-heavy diet. They had 3 additional diets, a purely vegan diet that had nothing but plant sources of food. And then they had the plant sources of food, the vegan diet, supplemented with either eggs, the ovo, or milk, the lactose. And what you see is that you can feed more people on the available cropland if you have a milk-based diet with plant-based diet than any other combination. Because milk provides essential nutrients that you do not get easily from plants. And so that's our primary reason for promoting milk worldwide. Now, we have lots of cows around the world that produce milk. And I looked at the 2018 data from the FAO. And on the left, we have a series of countries that have the largest number of dairy cows. These countries had to have at least 1% of the dairy cow population of the world. And you can see India, Brazil, Pakistan, USA rank among the top countries in terms of numbers of cows. Now on the right-hand side, we see some red bars that represent countries that produce at least 1% of the world's milk, but they do not have 1% of the world's cows. And so we developed an equation we call intensity of production, where we took a country's percentage of the world milk, or their world's milk, and divide it by their percentage of the world's cows. So if you have a low number, that means that you're producing way below the world average, and if you have a high number, you're considerably above the world average. And what you see here is that most of the developed dairy countries of the world are producing significantly higher than the world average. Although Israel doesn't have 1% of the world's milk or 1% of the world's cows, I calculated the production intensity, as you can see on the very right over here. And the highest production intensity of the world is in Israel, meaning that you're producing more milk per cow on the average than other countries of the world. One of the disconcerting things that concerns us is that we look at the left, those countries have many, many millions of cows that produce at extraordinarily low levels, and that has an adverse impact really on the environment. The question is often asked, how much milk are cows capable of producing? So what we did was get individual records from one of our DHIA processing centers in the United States. And we had Jersey cows and Holstein cows. In our data set, we had 1.4 million Holstein cows, and we had nearly 81,000 Jersey cows. And we had those ranked as parity 1, or first calf, parity 2, parity 3 plus. And we looked at the top yield and the 99th percentile. So if we look at the 99th percentile, cows were producing anywhere from about 77 kilograms per day to 49 kilograms per day among the Holsteins and Jerseys. But you realize that each percentile has a lot of cows. For example, in Holsteins, one percentile has 14,000 cows, and in Jerseys, one percentile has 809 cows. So then we ask the question, what is the very top cow producing? The very top. Among the Holsteins, we had one cow that was producing 127 kilograms per day. And among Jerseys, we had a cow that was producing 114 kilograms per day. Our conclusion was, since the Jerseys and Holsteins are very close at the very top end, that may be near the maximum amount that a cow can produce in 24-hour period. Very high production in both groups, incredibly high production among the highest producing cows. So that's at least the upper end of the potential for cows in terms of daily milk production. The other thing that we've done is to extrapolate and look at where we think cows will be producing 50 years in the future. And this very heavy black line that you see is the average milk production. This is in kilograms per year in the US over about a 50, 60 year period. And these are all breeds. We also looked at specifically the two cows that started their records in 2018, had a calf in 2018. Among cows that calved in 2018 in the United States, 85.6% were Holstein, 13.4% were Jersey. So that means 99% of our cows were in those two breeds. And for that year, the average production per cow per Holstein on a standardized basis was 12,430 kilograms of milk, 3.86 fat, and 3.11 true protein. We actually measure true protein rather than just nitrogen divided by a number to estimate protein. The Jerseys averaged about 9,300 kilograms, 4.38 tests for fat, 3.68 for true protein. We extrapolated those curves either linearly or polynomially, exponentially, just mathematically. Our best curve was this polynomial curve, which says that in 50 years from now, our cows will be producing on the average about 20,000 kilograms of milk per year. Now, this could change a little bit. If we change the emphasis on fat and protein concentrations or other components of milk, that could slow down the total yield in terms of volume, but we'd still see a continued increase from year to year, because if you select for components, you actually select for increased milk yield. If we look at the genetics of the cow in the future, here are ideas about where we're headed. Our cattle are going to be genomic based, not necessarily breed based. We know there are some genes that we could move from one breed to another breed that would enhance some of their qualities, maybe their heat tolerance, might change their composition, may improve their health or fertility. So we'll be focusing on genomics. We'll also have increased emphasis on epigenetics. Epigenetics is a way of environment affecting gene expression without changing the DNA sequence, without changing the genome. Really, it's how the genome functions, not the sequence. We'll be selecting cows on their microbiomics. We already know the microbiome is very important. Some really good work in Israel in this area. Recent papers show the heritability of microbiomics is considerable. And so I think we'll be selecting cows at birth based on their microbiomics and then manipulating that. We'll be focusing on cows that have a lower environmental footprint, produce less greenhouse gases. That means cows are probably going to get a bit smaller. Maybe won't have as much change in body condition score. Certainly they'll be healthier and more fertile. We'll continue. We've seen a great improvement in that if we put more emphasis in our selection indexes. I think we will be looking at specific casein proteins and fatty acids and selecting milk that has a quality that is somewhat different than the average milk, so you have a better cheese yield or you have a healthier fatty acids in milk. Those are things that we could do fairly easily. We'll probably use some gene editing. For example, it may be easy to gene edit the horns off of cattle. The consumers would like that. That's a pretty simple procedure. It's actually been demonstrated to be done effectively in experiments. And we'll have some proprietary genes. Some cows may be selected to produce a certain quality of milk that has extreme value for health, and there'd be a premium paid for that. And so companies might license those embryos, if you will, to farmers to produce that proprietary product. One of the new concepts in terms of gene selection is a term called resilience. Resilience is really the ability of an animal to respond back to a normal state after perturbation. This was published in 2019. This top line shows, first of all, a standard milk production curve underlying two different cows. The cow that is illustrated by the black line stays very close to the curve. If there's any sort of perturbation, such as you see here, that cow returns back to the normal curve very quickly. The lighter gray we see here, this cow takes a long time to return back, as she does here and here. And so really animals that have some sort of perturbation, injury, disease, mastitis, if they return back to normal quickly, that's a very valuable trait. And so we may be using big data coming from all of our sensors and our devices to identify those cows that are resilient and have a higher selection intensity or index on that kind of trait. Now, epigenetics is becoming more and more important as we learn more about it. Let's start over here on the left with our oocyte, which has only one set of DNA. Instead of being diploid, it's haploid. Sperm cells have one set of DNA, the paternal DNA, if you will, and the maternal DNA. Most of the genes are actually turned off at the oocyte stage and the sperm stage. But once you get fertilization, those genes are turned back on. And that's what happens when the embryo develops. And it's those genes being turned back on and controlled that cause the various specializations of tissue that we see, the embryonic area, the zona pellucida, the inner cell mass area. And then those cells can become specialized cells in the body. If we look at the mammary gland are stem cells that continue to reproduce over a cow's life, and they may be affected by the environment. They may be affected epigenetically. The DNA doesn't change, but how the DNA is expressed in the cells may change. Same thing is true in the ovarian cells. As the oocyte grows and the cells around the egg grow, they may be influenced by environmental effects through epigenetic processes. One of the most studied areas in epigenetics is really heat stress. And of course, Israel is the world leaders in doing that. But Jeff Dahl at the University of Florida did an interesting experiment a few years ago. He allowed cows that were pregnant during the last 45 days of pregnancy to be either cool or heat stressed. Now, this is in Florida, hot tropical climate. So those cows that were not cool were subjected to the typical tropical heat stress. The other cows were cooled in a freestall barn with fans and misters, a typical cooling system. Not only was the cow affected, but the developing embryo in its last 48, or developing fetus in its last 45 days of life was affected. And from then on, after this generation, from then on, both that calf and her subsequent calves were always cooled through lactation and through the dry period. And they asked the question, what happens if we do that? And what they found is quite interesting. There were obviously differences in body temperature between the cooled and the non-cooled cows, but that calf that was heat stressed in utero during the last 45 days of pregnancy produced less milk. And not only did she produce less milk, her daughters produced less milk, and her granddaughters produced less milk, even though all of them were cooled throughout pregnancy, including that last 45 days. That's a carryover effect that we see now for 3 generations in that study. So that's an example, a somewhat typical example of an epigenetic effect that can be carried to from one generation to the next, even though there's no change in the DNA. Another example is fertility. This is a study from Wisconsin. It involved 1,887 Holstein cows. All these cows were bred by timed AI at 82 days postpartum. But what they were really interested in is what happens to fertility at 82 days postpartum if cows have a body condition change around calving, around the transition period. And you see they had cows that lost body condition during 3 weeks after calving, or maintained body condition during 3 weeks after calving, or gained body condition during 3 weeks after calving. And then they looked at the pregnancy rate at timed AI. It was 25% in the cows that lost, 38% in the cows that maintained, and 84% in the cows that gained body condition during that 3-week period. So another example of the oocyte being heat stressed many months before it actually is ovulated, and that's an epigenetic effect. So the oocyte did not change its DNA, but how its genes were expressed in terms of survival is very clear. It turns out that most of these cows, the eggs are actually fertilized and begin to develop, but they die within the first 4 to 7 days. Now, one of the things we believe will happen in the future is we'll start using embryos much more than semen in transferring genetics from a superior level to commercial herds, if you will. So the AI centers may start selling more embryos than they do semen. And at least in theory, we can do this in the test tube, in the petri dish. Chinese scientists have already shown they can do this with the oocyte, with the female germ cell, if you will, grow those repeatedly in the petri dish. So over here on the right is an example of a theoretical example of what we might do. We might collect cells from blastocysts, put those into culture so they become stem cells, treat them in certain ways so they begin to develop, as they would normally develop in the animal, into either oogonia or spermatogonia. Continue to keep those in culture so that they actually form oocytes and spermatozoa. And then we would do in vitro maturation and fertilization to get fertilized oocytes in the culture dish. Again, this is theory, but the steps that are being taken to accomplish this are occurring pretty rapidly. If we could do this, then we could go through 3 or 4 or 5 generations a year, maybe 5 or 6 generations a year in the petri dish, and we would make extraordinary changes in the genetic potential of those oocytes. And then we would take the best ones and we would grow them as embryos and put them into the population of animals, if you will. So we may be doing genetics a lot differently in 50 years than we are doing them today. We hear a lot about climate change, and we hear a lot about ruminants producing methane that has an impact on the climate. But what do the real data say about this? These are data over about a 50-year period, measurements of carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere measured on exactly the same basis. In this case, they're measured on CO2 equivalent. We can convert any greenhouse gas to a CO2 equivalency. And this has been done. And so over that period of time, the carbon dioxide intensity, if you will, in the atmosphere increased 122%, methane only 49%. So methane's impact is clearly much less than the impact of carbon dioxide. Methane stays in the atmosphere about 9 or 10 years. If you put one molecule of methane into the air right now, it will stay in the atmosphere for 9 to 12 years. One molecule of carbon dioxide will stay about 1,000 years. So the carryover long-term effect is greater for carbon dioxide and methane. But really, I think what is worrisome is that if we look at the amount of methane or greenhouse gas produced per kilogram of milk, it differs a lot around the world, around the globe. On the right, we have what we might call the advanced dairy countries. These are countries that produce at high level, regions that produce at high level. You see that when these data were collected in 2018, the levels in these developed countries were slightly over 1. Some countries now may be slightly below 1. That's 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas per kilogram of milk. These countries in the developing world have extraordinarily high greenhouse gas output per kilogram of milk. And this is where most of the cows are. It's not over here on this part. It's mostly over here in these regions. Sub-Saharan Africa, Western Asia, Northern Asia, Western Asia, Northern Africa, South Asia, Central and South America, and East Asia. Up to 5 times more greenhouse gas per kilogram of milk over here than over here. So from a climatic standpoint, these countries are contributing very heavily to methane in the atmosphere. One of the big changes we think is going to happen and is continuing to happen is use of sensors and automation and now robotics and artificial intelligence on the dairy farm. And those sensors are going to be in everywhere we look, in the soils and crops and milking centers, in the waterways, on the roads and vehicles. And those are going to be integrated sensors, data going to the cloud using blockchain or something like that would keep the individual cow or individual farm confidential. What we think needs to happen is this becomes an open source of data shared among companies, different types of instruments used, but the sensor data would be converted to some sort of constant methodology so that we could collect data from activity monitors, from thermometers, from Reuben boluses, from sensors on the farm. And if we have the open source data available, then we can develop applications that would run across different products and different types of systems that are being used, which would be a very valuable tool for farmers. Let me just point out a couple of kinds of things that are new. This is a biodegradable chip. It has human cells actually growing on that, but we could put a biodegradable chip into the udder or liver of cows that would not have to be removed at slaughter, but might provide very good information about the health and welfare of the cow during lactation or during stressful periods. This happens to be a new system that's just been installed on 2 farms in the United States. It handles all of the manure, all of the runoff waste, all of the liquid on the farm, and turns it back into drinkable water, a sterile, dry material that can be used for bedding or compost, and a high liquid ammonia nitrogen fertilizer. These systems were really developed initially for villages in Africa and other places that did not have water systems or municipal sewage systems. But now a system has been developed for dairy farms. They're quite expensive, so they need to be shared among farms or used on very large farms. But this is a great opportunity for the dairy industry to have carbon neutral farming in the future. One of the things that's important for dairy farmers today, it's always been important, and I know that the farmers in Israel have done this very well, and that is to collaborate. This is an example of a group of very large farms in northern Indiana. It's called the Fair Oaks Group. Some of you may be familiar with that. These are family-owned farms. They have about 35,000 cows, about 10 farms. They farm about 15,000 hectares. But what's really impressive is what these folks do in terms of sharing. They share purchasing, they share marketing, they share payroll management, personnel management. They share trucking and hauling, as well as cropping. They can plan the cropping across the entire area so that they have the optimal planning and harvesting time. They have a common methane digester that generates methane, which goes into the public natural gas lines that run across the country. So they're earning revenue from that. The residue from the methane digester goes through a system that removes all the phosphorus. The phosphorus goes back to the fertilizer plant. They actually harvest more phosphorus out of their methane digester than they purchase to put on the crops to begin with. So that is environmentally very important. They have the water recovery system I just showed you on the previous slide that will be applied across the entire facility. These folks are also interested in the earth and the soil and the environment, so they have a habitat management program that is shared among all of these farms so that wildlife and streams in the area are kept clean. The habitat can move across the area safely, and it's a way of really promoting strong environmental management in the farming area. We're going to see lots of use of microbiomic technology. We might call that a disruptive technology in the future that's going to benefit our crops and our cows. We'll see it in agronomy. We're already seeing it in agronomy. Companies have mixtures of microbes that are coated on the seeds before they're planted. Those microbes stimulate root growth on the plant, and yields are increasing up to 20% simply by coating the seeds with microbes. We'll see that in our silos. We'll see that in our crops that are planted. We're also going to see it, I think, in terms of environmental management, using specific microbes in our waste systems to make them cleaner, to make them have lower emissions and lower odors, which are bothersome in some areas. We'll see cow-specific microbiomic use, probably starting out with a baby calf. Baby calves already have a microbiome when they're born, maybe enriching that so they have a better microbiome for their rumen health in the future. Can be done at birth, shortly thereafter. We may be adding some microbes to our diet that enhance digestion in the rumen. There may be even some that are therapeutic that would be licensed to replace existing medicines and drugs that we use today. So we're going to see a tremendous growth in this area and use in agriculture over the next several years. One of the most exciting things that's been published just in the last few years, published in 2019, is how gene editing of a single gene in plants in the photosynthesis cycle can significantly increase yield and how well plants acquire and utilize energy coming from the sun. This diagram over here kind of depicts what they did. These two genes are in the normal photosynthesis cycle. They kind of are wasteful, not very efficient. And in this gene editing, they simply blocked those two genes. And when they did that, the biomass yield, the increase of plants on the farm, in the field, these were actually field studies, not greenhouse studies, were increased by 40%, and the efficiency in capturing light was increased by 17%. If we could do this with our feed crops or food crops around the world, it would have a tremendous impact on the amount that we can produce per hectare of land. It could be a real problem solver for us in the future in terms of feeding the world. These are some of our ideas and concepts about the future. We call this reaching for the future. But really, the future is not unknown. The future is what we envision and what we create. And obviously, the Israeli dairy industry has done a great job of doing that. And certainly, we think that there are going to be some exciting changes in the future that allow us to be even more successful. Thank you so much for this opportunity.